Hi everyone, my name is Neal Sweeney. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a member of UAW Local 4811, and I work in the UAW Higher Ed Department. Previously, I have been a neuroscience researcher as a graduate student, a postdoc, and a staff researcher at the University of California. Could you start the slides, please? Last Friday evening, I'm going to give some background about the cuts in research that the Trump administration is trying to force through and their impacts on research budgets, on research at universities, and on jobs and communities, and to give people the tools to fight back. Can you go to the next slide, please? So late Friday evening, last Friday evening, to be exact, at 6:19 Eastern time, the Trump administration announced that it was slashing research funding by reducing overhead rates, or also known as indirect cost rates, immediately, and this would affect all current and future grants. Researchers and university workers around the country immediately realized that this would lead to massive cuts to research budgets and would stop research in clinical trials such as on cancer, Alzheimer's, and many more in their tracks. And not only that, instead of saving money, it would decimate jobs and local economies. But through our unions and by organizing, we are fighting back. I'm going to share some background about how research funding works so we can debunk some myths, so we can talk to our coworkers, organize our friends and families, and demand to our elected representatives that they reverse these cuts. So if you go, this is the announcement that they put out late Friday evening. So can you go to the next slide, please? So it's important to remember that this isn't the first time the Trump administration tried to slash science budgets. They tried almost the exact same thing in 2017 by cutting these overhead rates. They failed. They also tried to cut NIH budget. That's on the right side there. You can see cuts of 22% to the NIH, 25% to cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. What happened? They tried to cut. Actually, research funding was increased that year. Even though they tried to cut it by 25%, research funding went up by about 10% to the NIH. And you can see this is NIH funding over time. Between the years of 2017 and 2020, each year, NIH funding increased. Why? Because people organized. This pictures from the March for Science. That was just one example, but many forms of organizing. People fought back so that they fought back against the cuts and actually won higher rates of research funding. So can you move on to the next? So indirect costs, it's kind of a weird, obscure title, seems wonky. And that's part of the goal. They want to think that, oh, they're just cutting something that's not part of, it's not really research, it's just this like technical thing. These rich universities are getting all this money. But we're actually in a fight for research in the public interest. Don't believe me? Project 2025, the extreme right-wing manifesto calls out indirect costs specifically and claims that they subsidize leftist agendas. Is fighting cancer a leftist agenda? I guess it is. So moving on to the next slide. So just a broad overview of research budget. This is the University of California. Grants and contracts are the #2 source of funding for the University of California after the medical centers. And of those, 1 in 6 revenue dollars comes from a grant or contract, and about half of those comes from a federal grant or contract. And that's exactly what's being targeted right now. If you go on to the next slide. So you get a research grant. It comes in kind of 2 different forms. You get things, what's called direct costs, salaries, benefit, things, equipment, supplies for your research, travel, and another category, what's called indirect cost. And indirect costs are also known as overhead, but they cover costs that are essential to the university's ability to conduct that research. These include facilities, building maintenance, and administration. Now, what does that mean exactly? It sounds kind of vague. You could easily slide into, this is like myth number 1. Does it really fund research? If you cut this stuff, does it mean actually more money for real research? Wrong. If you move on to the next slide, you can see what this funds are actually spent on. So you're working in a lab, you're doing your research. There's all kinds of workers at the university that support that research and all kinds of other funding. So there's many kinds of workers, financial analysts, technical workers, administrative, maintenance workers, janitorial, security. They all support the research. Some of these funds go to make sure it's a safe workplace, that you know, lab waste gets disposed of correctly, that you have internet and other resources to do your research, that you have library and access to journals to do your research. There's core facilities that are essential for like microscopes and other kind of processing facilities. Utilities, just running the building. So these are all parts that if they were cut, the research probably couldn't go on, and it's going to mean job loss across the university. Next slide, please. So just for one example on one grant, what these cuts are going to mean. So let's say you get a grant of $500,000, kind of an average grant. Indirect costs are expressed as a percentage of that grant. So if you get a grant of $500,000, in this example, the indirect costs rate is 64%. So on top of that, you get another 64%. So in this example, direct cost 500,000, indirect cost 320,000, total grant 820,000. So that's just kind of your standard grant, how it works now. Next slide, please. So under this cut, it would be a 30% reduction in the size of the grant. Instead of 820,000 between direct and indirect costs, that would be slashed to by 30%. So if you expand that to all the grants, this would be blow a massive hole in research budgets, and would likely lead to layoffs and would just stop the research in their tracks. Next slide, please. So just a few myths. I'll go over this quickly. I already covered this. Are indirect costs, some kind of slush fund? No, they're highly regulated. They're negotiated with the university and the federal government every year, and they go to real jobs, real necessary and important purposes that directly support the research. Number two, is it actually more money to spend on actual science? False. We saw Trump's agenda is to slash science. We need to fight back, so he can't do that. Number three, they make this false equivalence between how private foundations and the federal government fund research. That's a false equivalence. Private foundations at times offer less overhead. The university can decide to accept that or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But if they accept it, they're actually losing money. They have to subsidize that from other sources. And they only decide to accept it because they know the federal government pays higher rates. So to claim that the federal government and a private foundation are the same, totally false, and just builds this argument that they're slashing research budgets. Last slide, I just want to mention that there's 22 attorneys general filed a lawsuit to put this on hold. Temporary restraining order was issued Monday morning. That's a good step. We need to use the courts when we can, but we can't rely on the courts. We need to organize and fight back. And just to finish off, every research dollar, this has been found time and time again, every research dollar translates into $2.50 in economic activity. So they claim they're saving money, false. It'll actually destroy economies. And research funding supports hundreds of thousands of jobs in every state and nearly every congressional district. So we're going to be talking about how to talk about your research and how to fight back and how to organize. We need to make sure all the members of Congress hear that these cuts are going to destroy jobs in their district. Back to you, Margaret.